Pick it up, boy. That scream echoed through a sprawling ballroom filled with 200 of the wealthiest and most powerful people on the planet. A crumpled $20 bill fluttered through the air and landed violently on the pristine Italian marble floor. It stopped right next to the worn-out, taped-up sneakers of a 6-year-old child. Standing directly over him was Edward Langford, a billionaire hedge fund manager whose custom-tailored suit cost more than the boy's exhausted mother would earn in an entire decade. Langford's face was twisted in an ugly, mocking sneer. "That 20 is more than your kind earns using their brains," he spat, pointing an arrogant finger at a $50,000 chessboard sitting on a mahogany table. The massive crowd of elites erupted into cruel, echoing laughter. They raised their crystal champagne glasses, deeply amused by the public humiliation of a tiny, defenseless child. The little boy did not cry. He did not flinch. He simply stared up at the towering billionaire with eyes that held an ancient, chilling calmness. Have you ever had a rich man throw dirty money at your feet and expect you to crawl for it like a desperate dog? Watch closely what happens when a 6-year-old boy decides not to crawl. To truly understand how this tiny, invisible child ended up facing down an apex predator in a room full of corporate sharks, we need to rewind the clock. We need to go back past the cruel laughter, past the arrogant $1 million bet, and step inside the suffocating, glittering world that built the Langford Empire. Welcome to the Langford estate, a sprawling fortress of extreme wealth hidden securely behind heavy iron gates at the end of a private, heavily guarded road. It was a sickening monument to excess. There were 12 massive, perfectly decorated bedrooms where no one ever slept. There was a cavernous ballroom decorated with 3 imported crystal chandeliers that blinded the eye. There was a climate-controlled garage filled to the brim with vintage sports cars that never saw a single drop of rain. At the very center of this golden cage ruled Edward Langford, a 56-year-old financial titan. Langford had built a terrifying $4 billion hedge fund by doing one specific thing perfectly. He found people's deepest weaknesses, and he squeezed them until they shattered into pieces. Wall Street called him a shark, a title he wore with absolute sickening pride. But for Langford, accumulating more money was no longer the main objective of his life. He already had more money than he could possibly spend in 10 lifetimes. What he craved right now was power, absolute submission, and the desperate, crawling envy of other men. He aggressively collected things that other ordinary people could not ever hope to have. He bought priceless Renaissance paintings. He bought rare vintage watches locked securely in thick glass cases. And he bought people. He demanded an audience whenever he asserted his dominance over someone weaker. Guests at his lavish, exclusive parties learned very quickly to laugh at his terrible jokes a half-second early. They laughed exactly the way terrified employees laugh at a tyrant boss who controls their weekly paychecks. And moving completely silently through the middle of all this blinding marble and obscene money was an exhausted woman named Denise. Denise was the invisible housekeeper. For 6 grueling, thankless years, she had meticulously maintained the Langford estate. Every single morning, she rode the 5:40 train in the freezing pitch-black cold, just to clean 12 pristine bedrooms that were already absolutely spotless. She polished heavy antique silver cutlery that nobody in the house ever bothered to eat with. Her hands were severely cracked, rough, and bleeding from industrial cleaning bleach. Her spine ached with a dull, constant fire that she never dared to mention to anyone for fear of losing her job. She was entirely invisible to the rich, powerful people floating arrogantly around her. Langford never once bothered to learn her actual name. He simply referred to her as the help, with a tone dripping with pure condescension. When something expensive went missing in the mansion, Denise was always the very first one to be aggressively interrogated. When the missing item was eventually found in Langford's own coat pocket, nobody ever offered an apology to her. She swallowed the harsh insults, the baseless suspicion, and the sheer daily degradation. She took it all, not because she lacked personal pride, but because pride does not pay the skyrocketing city rent. Pride does not put hot, nourishing food on the dinner table. And her 6-year-old son Miles desperately needed school supplies, a warm winter coat, and a fighting chance at a decent future. Miles was a tiny, fragile-looking boy, but his eyes were like deep, quiet wells that absorbed absolutely everything around him. He had a small mouth that said almost nothing, a vital survival mechanism he had learned very early in life. After school ended, the little boy had nowhere else to go. He took 2 crowded public buses across town to the massive estate and waited patiently in the freezing servant's kitchen until his mother finished her brutal shifts. The house rules for the boy were strictly enforced and terrifyingly simple to understand. Stay hidden in the shadowy corner. Stay completely silent at all times. Touch absolutely nothing that belongs to the master. So little Miles sat quietly on a hard wooden stool by the pantry, holding a worn-out library book, making himself as small and invisible as humanly possible. He was exceptionally bright, absorbing complex information like a dry sponge, but in this massive house his intelligence meant absolutely nothing. In this house he was just worthless dirt on the bottom of a billionaire's expensive leather shoe. Upstairs, sitting right in the exact center of Langford's private study, was the ultimate symbol of the billionaire's towering, fragile ego. It was a breathtaking $50,000 chessboard, carved entirely from rare walnut and maple, sitting under a glowing brass gallery lamp. The stunning pieces were imported directly from Vienna, incredibly heavy and flawless in design. Hanging on the wall right beside it was a framed, yellowing newspaper clipping from several decades ago. It prominently showed a 20-year-old Langford smirking wildly over a massive collegiate chess trophy. 36 years later, he still wore that exact same unbearable, punchable smirk on his face. Chess was not just a simple board game to Edward Langford. It was his absolute favorite weapon of psychological destruction. At his elite, invite-only dinner parties, he would loudly offer a game to any guest brave or foolish enough to sit across from him. Then he would slowly, viciously, and methodically dismantle them on the board. He would arrogantly narrate their catastrophic mistakes out loud for the entire room to hear, humiliating them piece by agonizing piece. "You see what he did there?" Langford would gloat loudly, swirling his incredibly expensive scotch in his glass. "That is exactly how stupid people lose millions of dollars when they try to compete with me." Then he would deliver the toxic line he loved the absolute most, raising his crystal glass to mock the defeated opponent. "No one in this room has ever beaten me, and no one ever will." The deeply humiliated guests would simply chuckle nervously and stare down at their perfectly polished shoes. Nobody ever dared to challenge his towering intellect again. Winning a simple game against Edward Langford was considered a terrible move for anyone's business career. Losing to him, however, was the mandatory, painful price of admission into his elite, wealthy circle. Everyone in the high society world knew the unspoken, golden rule of the estate. You must always let Edward win. But one ordinary Thursday evening, something tiny, unscripted, and entirely forbidden happened in that dimly lit, silent study. Something that nobody in the world was ever supposed to witness. Denise was nervously vacuuming the luxurious upstairs hallway, the heavy machine humming loudly over the thick carpet. 6-year-old Miles was quietly carrying a heavy silver tray of empty water glasses past the open study doors. A lazy, impatient caterer had shoved the heavy tray into the tiny boy's hands without a single second thought. Miles suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. The magnificent $50,000 board was currently arranged mid-game, frozen in a famous historical position from a legendary championship match. But something about the board was terribly fundamentally wrong. One white knight was sitting exactly one single square away from where history had originally placed it. And that one tiny misplaced square completely broke the entire flawless mathematical logic of the Grandmaster's position. A normal 6-year-old child would not even know what a knight was supposed to do. But little Miles knew this specific board position, the exact same way other children know the lyrics to their favorite nursery rhymes. The tiny boy carefully set the heavy silver tray down on a nearby mahogany side table. He looked nervously over his small shoulder, his tiny heart hammering violently against his ribs. The grand hallway was completely empty. He slowly reached out a trembling, tiny hand and slid the heavy wooden knight exactly one square to the left. There was a soft, incredibly satisfying click of wood sliding on wood. The entire board instantly made perfect sense again. Interesting. A sudden, calm voice echoed from the deep shadows behind him. Miles froze in absolute, paralyzing terror. A silver-haired man stepped slowly out from the heavy, suffocating shadows of the billionaire's private study. He was holding a crystal glass of sparkling club soda in his elegant, steady hand. He had incredibly calm, observing eyes that missed absolutely nothing in the room. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit that did not need to shout to announce its immense value. This man was not Edward Langford. Miles stood completely frozen on the thick, imported carpet, his tiny heart pounding frantically against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was already desperately rehearsing a frantic apology in his head. He expected the man to scream for the security guards, to drag him away, to instantly fire his exhausted mother. But the mysterious silver-haired man did not yell. He only glanced down at the freshly corrected wooden knight on the glowing board. Then he looked back at the terrified 6-year-old boy. He looked at Miles the exact same way a master jeweler glances at a priceless diamond that everyone else in the world has foolishly walked past. "Most adults get that knight wrong," the man said quietly, his voice smooth and incredibly deliberate. "You didn't." Miles did not wait to hear another single word. He grabbed his heavy silver tray with trembling little hands and bolted from the room as fast as his worn-out sneakers could carry him. He darted down the endless, winding corridors of the mansion, terrified that the heavy footsteps of a billionaire would follow him. He did not catch the stranger's name that terrifying night, but he would absolutely hear it again very soon. He would hear it spoken with intense, fearful respect in a crowded room full of incredibly wealthy people who had absolutely no respect for a poor child. Down in the stifling hot servants' kitchen later that evening, Denise aggressively scrubbed a stubborn stain on a massive copper pot. When her son practically tumbled through the swinging kitchen doors, completely breathless and pale, she immediately dropped her heavy sponge. Denise possessed a terrifying ability to read her son's face the way only a desperately protective mother ever can. She wiped her raw, cracked hands on her faded, stained apron and marched straight over to him. "You touched something," she whispered harshly. It was absolutely not a question. Miles dropped his tiny head, staring intently at the dirty floor tiles. He slowly opened his small mouth to try and explain the complicated night, the incredibly wrong square, the fundamentally broken chess position. But Denise fiercely cut him off before a single word could escape his lips. She shot him a terrifying, desperate look that she had spent 6 agonizing years perfecting in this horrible house. "Listen to me right now," she hissed, gripping his tiny shoulders with trembling, bleach-stained hands. "In this massive house, we do not ever correct rich men. We do not ever show them how smart we are. We do not get noticed. You keep your head down, you keep your hands to yourself, and we get to go home to our safe, quiet apartment. Do you hear me?" Miles swallowed the heavy, suffocating lump of terror in his tiny throat. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered softly, and he truly meant it with every fiber of his tiny being. Miles had absolutely no ambitious plans to be noticed by anybody in that terrifying, oppressive house. He just desperately wanted to read his borrowed library book, wait for his exhausted mother to finish polishing the endless silverware, and disappear back into the safe, invisible darkness of their poor neighborhood. But fate had an entirely different, incredibly cruel plan waiting for him. Exactly 3 weeks after that quiet incident in the study, the heavy, expensive invitations went out in the mail. They were printed on impossibly thick, imported cream cardstock with glowing raised gold lettering. Langford Capital had just officially crossed $4 billion in total managed assets. And Edward Langford, drowning in his own bottomless ego, was throwing himself a massive, disgusting party to make sure the entire Eastern Seaboard knew how powerful he was. He invited 200 of the most influential, terrifyingly wealthy guests imaginable. There were corrupt senators, ruthless rival fund managers, and a ridiculously famous celebrity chef flown in directly from Manhattan just for the evening. For an entire exhausting week, the massive house filled to the brim with loud, demanding strangers. An army of frantic florists stacked thousands of incredibly expensive white roses all the way up to the painted ceilings. Underpaid workers strung thousands of glowing fairy lights across the sprawling, manicured lawn like a sea of grounded stars. And through it all, Edward Langford proudly walked his long marble halls, loudly rehearsing his arrogant toast to the empty walls. Every single evening, he paused smugly at the doorway of his private study. He admired his $50,000 chessboard and the yellowing newspaper clipping of his younger, victorious self. He looked at it exactly like a greedy, bloated king admiring his heavy, unearned crown. Because of the massive, ridiculous scale of the party, Denise was aggressively ordered to work a punishing double shift. That meant tiny 6-year-old Miles, with absolutely nowhere else to go in the dangerous city, would be trapped in the suffocating kitchen that entire night. He was told to sit perfectly still on his hard wooden stool, keep his tiny head down, and absolutely not breathe a word. And for the first 3 agonizing hours of the night, it almost worked perfectly. Nobody in the house noticed the tiny, silent boy hiding in the chaotic kitchen at all. Out in the grand ballroom, the night of the party glittered aggressively like the inside of a priceless locked jewelry case. 200 of the absolute wealthiest, most terrifying people on the entire East Coast drank incredibly expensive champagne directly under 3 blinding crystal chandeliers. Women wore diamond necklaces that could feed an entire neighborhood for a year. Men smoked imported cigars and laughed loudly at jokes that were not funny, terrified of offending the men who were slightly richer than they were. Edward Langford floated arrogantly between them, collecting their fake, desperate congratulations like a ruthless landlord collecting monthly rent. Around 10 o'clock, the overworked caterers completely ran out of available hands to serve the demanding, thirsty guests. A deeply stressed, sweating floor manager stormed into the kitchen, looking frantically for anyone to help carry the heavy trays. His crazed eyes violently locked onto the tiny 6-year-old boy sitting quietly in the shadowy corner. He aggressively pointed a shaking, desperate finger directly at Miles. "You!" the manager barked rudely. "Carry this out there right now. Go." So the tiny, invisible boy in the faded, taped-up second-hand sneakers was violently thrust out of the shadows. He awkwardly balanced a heavy silver tray full of crystal champagne flutes that weighed almost as much as he did. He walked slowly, carefully, tray after heavy tray, straight through a suffocating sea of expensive black tuxedos and glittering diamond necklaces. He kept his tiny eyes glued to the shiny floor, doing exactly as his terrified mother had strictly taught him. His perfect, invisible strategy worked flawlessly, right up until he made the terrible mistake of passing by the open doors of the private study. The heavy mahogany doors stood wide open for the party, allowing the guests to admire the $50,000 board glowing under its brass lamp. Miles only ever meant to walk straight past it without looking. But out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that the famous chess position from 3 weeks ago was proudly back on display, and his tiny, exhausted feet completely stopped walking before his cautious judgment could frantically catch them. 5 seconds. 5 agonizing, silent seconds was all it took for the entire world to completely shatter. Well, look at this. Edward Langford's arrogant, booming voice cut violently through the crowded room like a sharp metal fork scraping viciously on broken glass. He stood in the massive, towering doorway of the study with a dozen of his most important, incredibly wealthy guests standing directly behind him. Edward Langford was holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch in his perfectly manicured hand. A vicious, deeply cruel grin was already fully loaded onto his arrogant face. The entire ballroom suddenly went terrifyingly quiet. The classical string quartet playing softly in the corner abruptly stopped their music, the sudden silence ringing violently in everyone's ears. 200 pairs of cold, calculating, incredibly wealthy eyes turned slowly to look at the doorway. They looked past the towering billionaire and stared down at the tiny 6-year-old boy standing frozen on the carpet, struggling to balance a heavy silver tray of empty glasses. "The help's kid," Langford announced loudly to the entire room, his voice dripping with absolute toxic venom. "The little rat is in here studying my board." Langford took a slow, deliberate step into the study, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished wood floor. He pointed a mocking finger at the incredibly heavy $50,000 chess pieces. "You like that, boy?" Langford sneered, leaning down slightly so his alcohol-laced breath washed over the child's tiny face. "Do you even have the slightest idea what that board costs?" Langford paused dramatically, making sure the entire crowd of elites was hanging on to his every single word. "It costs more than your exhausted mother makes scrubbing my toilets in an entire year." A wave of low, cruel laughter rippled quickly through the suffocating crowd of millionaires. More guests drifted eagerly over to the open doors, smelling blood in the water, desperately wanting a front-row seat to the disgusting show. Behind the thick wall of expensive tuxedos and glittering designer dresses, Denise suddenly appeared. When she saw her tiny 6-year-old son standing completely trapped under the terrifying shadow of the billionaire, her face went absolutely paper white. She dropped the heavy serving tray she was holding, but the crashing sound was completely drowned out by the arrogant laughter of the crowd. Langford casually reached into the breast pocket of his custom-tailored jacket. He slowly, arrogantly pulled out a thick, heavy silver money clip stuffed entirely with crisp new $100 bills. With agonizing slowness, he peeled a single crumpled $20 bill from the very bottom of the thick stack. He held it up to the blinding chandelier light so everyone in the room could see it clearly. Then, with a violent flick of his wrist, he tossed it directly at the tiny boy's feet. The green bill spun slowly in the stifling air, floating downward, and landed softly on the cold Italian marble floor. "Pick it up, boy," Langford commanded, his voice suddenly sharp and incredibly dangerous. "That 20 is more than your kind will ever earn using their brains." Miles did not move a single muscle. The 6-year-old child just stood there, his tiny hands gripping the edges of his silver tray so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He looked down at the dirty money, then looked slowly back up at the towering billionaire, and said absolutely nothing at all. The heavy, suffocating silence in the room stretched out, pulling tighter and tighter like a metal piano wire about to violently snap. It stretched just long enough to make someone in the elite crowd feel slightly embarrassed by the sheer, unprovoked cruelty of the moment. A loud, tipsy voice from the back of the crowd suddenly broke the terrible tension. "Careful, Edward!" the drunken hedge fund manager yelled with a slurred laugh. "Maybe the little boy plays." And right there it was. The ultimate irresistible opening that Edward Langford absolutely never refused. He had an elite audience watching his every move. He had a tiny, completely defenseless victim standing right in front of him. He had a perfect, glittering stage to assert his total, crushing dominance. Langford slowly set down his crystal glass of scotch on a nearby mahogany table. He spread his long arms wide like a psychotic ringmaster welcoming the crowd to a twisted circus. "You know what?" Langford boomed, projecting his arrogant voice so the entire mansion could hear him clearly. "Tonight I am feeling incredibly, historically generous." He turned his cold, dead eyes back to the tiny 6-year-old boy. "One single game," Langford offered, his vicious smirk returning to his face. "If this tiny, uneducated kid somehow manages to beat me, a man who has been completely undefeated in this house for 20 straight years, I will write him a certified check for $1 million right here, right now." Langford paused dramatically, waiting for the massive collective gasp from the greedy crowd. He got exactly what he wanted. The room buzzed with instant electric shock. "But," Langford continued, his voice dropping into a dark, terrifying growl, "if he loses..." Langford looked directly over the crowd and locked eyes with the terrified, trembling mother. "If he loses, he and his mother will pack their pathetic little bags, walk out of my house into the freezing night, and they will never ever set foot in this zip code again. They are fired. They are blacklisted. They are done." "Mr. Langford, sir, please," Denise screamed, violently pushing her way through the thick crowd of millionaires. She practically fell to her knees at the edge of the study, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. "He is only 6 years old. We don't want any trouble, sir. I am begging you, please." Langford did not even look down at her. He stared straight at the tiny boy. "Then your boy should learn to keep his dirty little eyes off my expensive things," Langford said coldly. Miles slowly set his heavy silver tray down on the floor. He looked over at his weeping mother. He saw her raw, severely cracked hands frantically twisting the hem of her stained apron. He saw 6 agonizing years of swallowed insults, daily degradation, and brutal silent suffering standing right there in one trembling, broken woman. Then the tiny 6-year-old boy looked back down at the crumpled $20 bill lying on the cold marble floor like a sickening dare. Somewhere deep inside his worn-out, taped-up pocket, his tiny fingers found something solid. It was a small, incredibly old wooden king chess piece, its tiny crown completely worn smooth by 2 generations of working-class hands. Miles took a deep, steadying breath. "Okay," the 6-year-old boy said, his tiny voice ringing out with impossible, chilling clarity in the silent room. "One game." The massive ballroom absolutely erupted. It was not a cheer of support. It was the sickening roar of Roman aristocrats happily watching a tiny gladiator step into a locked cage with a starving lion. Someone in the back quickly pulled out an expensive smartphone. Then another. Within seconds, dozens of glowing red recording lights blinked to life, hovering fiercely over the shoulders of $1,000 tuxedos. A young, arrogant nephew of a massive banking CEO quickly opened a live streaming app on his phone. The viewer count was at 40, then 200, then climbing rapidly. They were all violently eager to watch a billionaire legally destroy a poor family's entire life for mere entertainment. Langford threw his head back and laughed, a deep booming sound that shook the crystal glasses. You hear that, everyone? The maid's boy accepts. He was right about that. He just had the winner entirely wrong. Let me break the fourth wall for a second and ask you a serious question. When you look at a 6-year-old boy wearing faded, hand-me-down clothes, what do you usually see? You see absolute weakness, right? You see someone who is incredibly fragile, someone who can be easily intimidated, easily broken, and easily crushed under the heel of power. That is exactly what Edward Langford saw when he looked down at that child. But the billionaire was utterly, catastrophically blind. Because what nobody in that glittering, suffocating ballroom knew, not the corrupt senators, not the laughing hedge fund managers, and definitely not the arrogant man holding the money clip, was where that quiet little boy had spent every single Saturday of his short, invisible life. And more importantly, they had absolutely no idea who had been waiting there in the freezing cold to teach him. While the panicked mansion staff frantically cleared a massive space in the exact center of the ballroom, and 200 glittering guests pressed in like a pack of starving wolves desperate for a show, 6-year-old Miles Brooks stood very, very still. In his mind, he was not standing in a multi-million-dollar mansion at all. He was light years away, sitting in a freezing, run-down public park in the absolute poorest district of the city, watching an old man with tired eyes set up a battered chessboard. Theodore Mason. He was Denise's father. Everyone in the struggling, forgotten neighborhood just called him Pops. For 40 grueling years, Pops had been an absolute, terrifying legend that nobody famous had ever bothered to hear about. By trade, he was a humble hotel doorman. He spent his exhausting days opening heavy, polished glass doors for wealthy, arrogant people who never once looked him in the eye or bothered to learn his name. But by absolute pure destiny, he was a chess master. Every single Saturday, through pouring rain, biting sleet, or freezing snow, Pop spent his days sitting at those cracked concrete tables in the park. He took on absolutely all comers for a mere $5 a game. He played arrogant college kids who thought they knew everything. He played aggressive local club champions. Once, he even played a touring international grandmaster who violently stopped smiling after exactly 12 moves. Pop systematically and quietly dismantled every single one of them. Then, he would gently shake their trembling hands across the concrete table and quietly give half of them their $5 back. He never once played in an official, rated tournament. Entry fees cost money, and every single dollar of money went directly to paying the suffocating city rent, to his exhausted daughter Denise, and later to a tiny grandson with huge, watchful eyes. The elite, wealthy chess world never learned his name, but the harsh, unforgiving park knew. And for Pops, the respect of the park was more than enough. Miles was barely 3 years old when Pops first lifted him up and sat him on a tall stack of stolen plastic milk crates at that freezing stone table. While other privileged toddlers were learning how to sing mindless cartoons and play with expensive wooden blocks, little Miles learned something entirely different. He learned that a knight moves in the shape of a deadly L and thinks exactly like a hidden, patient sniper. Every single Saturday for 2 years, the routine never broke. Pops taught him incredibly complex, devastating chess openings the exact same way other grandfathers taught their grandsons how to fish. He taught them patiently, slowly, with quiet, captivating stories about kings and invisible traps. He taught brilliant endgame strategies on a horribly warped cardboard board with a missing black pawn that they had to replace with a rusted soda bottle cap. But Pops taught one specific, burning lesson far above all the others. The board does not ask how much money your daddy has in the bank, little man, Pops would whisper. his rough, calloused hands resting gently on the cheap plastic pieces. It does not care what zip code you live in. It does not care if your clothes are torn or your shoes are taped together. 64 squares. The exact same number of pieces for both sides. It is the absolute only fair, truly equal place I have ever found in this entire cruel world. So when you sit down at this board, you do not bow your head to anyone. You sit down as a king. By the time Miles turned 5, the tiny toddler was completely destroying grown, educated men at the stone tables. Pop studied his tiny grandson across the board one freezing October afternoon and saw something that made his tired old eyes shine with unshed tears. "You are already better than me, little man," Pops whispered, a massive, proud smile breaking across his weathered face. "Just don't tell the rich folks yet." That brutal, unforgiving winter, Pop's overworked heart finally began to fail him. On the very last Saturday of his life, he was far too weak to walk to the freezing park. So Denise gently set the battered cardboard board right on his sterile, white hospital blanket. Pops could barely lift his own arms. His breathing was terribly shallow, rattling painfully in his chest. He played the game anyway. Halfway through the quiet match, the old man suddenly stopped moving. He slowly reached out and picked up his white king, the specific wooden piece with the crown worn completely smooth from 40 years of his heavy thumb pressing against it. He folded it gently into his tiny grandson's soft palm and firmly closed the boy's tiny fingers around it. "Listen to me very closely now," Pops breathed, his voice barely a rough, scraping whisper. "One day, some arrogant, wealthy man is going to look down at you and see absolutely nothing but a poor, worthless kid. They are going to laugh in your face before you even touch a single piece." Pops coughed violently, gripping the child's tiny hand with the last of his fading strength. "Do not argue with them. Do not scream. Do not cry. You let the board speak for you. The board never, ever lies." Pops died quietly on a Tuesday morning. Miles was only 5 years old. The tiny boy did not shed a single tear at the cheap, empty funeral. He walked straight to the freezing park instead, climbed onto his stack of milk crates, sat completely alone at the empty concrete table, and played both sides of his grandfather's favorite opening until the orange streetlights flickered on in the pitch-black night. After that devastating day, the 6-year-old's game went completely underground. A kind public school teacher had donated an old, terribly cracked laptop to Denise. Miles used it to access free, anonymous online chess websites. He created a simple username that gave absolutely nothing away about his tiny age or his extreme poverty: Stone Table 11. For an entire year, he played thousands upon thousands of grueling high-level games. Often, he played way past midnight, keeping the screen brightness incredibly low so his exhausted mother would not see the glowing light seeping under his bedroom door. He studied historical grandmaster games the exact same way religious scholars study ancient, sacred scripture. He replayed them move by agonizing move until the complex, deadly patterns lived permanently and automatically inside his tiny hands. By age 6, Stone Table 11 carried a terrifying online rating of 2,412. Pure, undeniable, terrifying master territory. Strong, arrogant adult club players actively avoided matching with him online. And the tiny boy had developed a highly specific, utterly lethal specialty. He aggressively hunted bullies. He absolutely loved playing against the arrogant players, the ones who attacked far too early, greedily grabbed pawns, and chased their queens violently across the board like a cruel landlord chasing rent money. Miles had meticulously built a private, hidden collection of devastating traps designed exclusively for exactly that kind of toxic, arrogant man. He could literally smell a fragile ego through a cracked computer screen. His exhausted mother never knew a single thing about it. She saw the glowing laptop in the dark and innocently assumed he was doing kindergarten spelling homework or watching cartoons. Chess was the one beautiful sacred secret Miles kept entirely to himself. Not out of shame, but because those 64 squares were the absolute last room in the world where his grandfather was still alive. And he was absolutely not ready to share that sacred room with anybody else. Let's bring it right back to the present moment. Now, in a blindingly bright Greenwich ballroom, a massive crowd of glittering, heartless strangers laughed cruelly at the exhausted maid's tiny 6-year-old son. And a man worth $4 billion loudly cracked his knuckles over a $50,000 imported chessboard, preparing to publicly slaughter a child for pure entertainment. Miles slowly pulled out the incredibly heavy velvet-lined chair and sat down. His tiny chin barely reached the edge of the polished mahogany table, deep inside his pocket, entirely out of sight from the laughing billionaires. His tiny thumb slowly traced the worn wooden crown of his grandfather's king. Someone is going to look at you and see nothing but a poor kid. Okay, Pops? The 6-year-old thought silently, his cold, dead eyes locking onto the arrogant billionaire sitting across from him. Let's let the board speak. They set the heavy mahogany table directly in the absolute center of the massive ballroom, right beneath the largest, most blinding crystal chandelier. Langford viciously insisted on exactly that setup. If he was going to teach this pathetic, poor child a brutal lesson in social hierarchy, he wanted to make absolutely sure the entire Eastern Seaboard was watching him do it. 2 terrified staff members carefully carried the $50,000 board from the study like solemn pallbearers carrying a heavy coffin. Expensive smartphones came out everywhere in the crowd. Dozens of them were quickly raised over expensive silk shoulders, their glowing red recording lights blinking fiercely in the dim room like a swarm of mechanical, bloodthirsty eyes. The arrogant hedge fund manager's nephew, standing near the front, loudly announced the status of his live stream. The viewer count had just crossed 4,000. 4,000 absolute strangers, tuning in just to watch a billionaire legally destroy a 6-year-old child's life. As Langford arrogantly rolled up the sleeves of his custom-tailored dress shirt, preparing for the slaughter, a silver-haired man in a quiet gray suit stepped smoothly out of the frantic crowd. Edward. The calm voice cut through the buzzing noise of the room. If there is $1 million of real money on this table, you will want a neutral referee to oversee the match. Langford turned around, and his cruel face instantly lit up with greedy delight. Walter! Langford boomed out to the crowd. Everyone, look who it is! Walter Hayes! Grandmaster Walter Hayes! The crowd murmured in deep, genuine awe. Walter Hayes was the absolute real thing. He was a legendary chess player who had once sat across from terrifying Russian world champions during the height of the Cold War. Perfect, Langford sneered, looking back down at the tiny boy whose chin barely reached over the table. Now nobody in the world can ever say I didn't crush the little rat fairly. 6-year-old Miles looked up and instantly recognized those incredibly calm, observing eyes. It was the quiet stranger from the study, the man who had watched him fix the misplaced wooden knight 3 weeks ago. Hayes gave absolutely no sign that they had ever met before. He simply took a formal, rigid position standing directly beside the mahogany table. State the terms of the wager, Edward, Hayes demanded, his voice projecting clearly and carrying absolute authority. State them clearly for the entire room to hear. Langford happily obliged, loving the taste of every single arrogant syllable in his mouth. A certified check for $1 million goes to the boy if he miraculously wins, Langford announced loud enough for every single phone microphone to pick up. If he loses, he and his exhausted mother leave my employment and my private property tonight, with absolutely nothing. Witnessed, Hayes said coldly. 200 glowing phone cameras silently witnessed it, too. Langford dropped heavily into his plush velvet chair and violently spun the heavy wooden board around. I play the white pieces, Langford declared, his sickening smirk fully returning. I always play white. He leaned across the board, staring down at the tiny, unblinking child. First lesson of the real world is free of charge, kid, Langford whispered maliciously. White moves first, which means I attack and you suffer. Miles said absolutely nothing in return. The 6-year-old boy simply reached out with his tiny, fragile hands and gently centered his black pieces one by one, exactly the way his grandfather Pops had taught him to do. Touch every single soldier before the bloody battle begins. Know exactly where everyone lives on the board. Move 1. Langford violently slammed his king's pawn forward 2 squares, pushing it hard enough to loudly rattle the heavy pieces standing in the rank directly behind it. It was the classic, aggressive opening of an arrogant man violently announcing his own presence. A few incredibly foolish guests in the front row actually applauded. They clapped their hands as if pushing a single pawn forward deserved a gold medal. Miles answered the move before the pathetic applause even faded from the air. His tiny hand slid his own pawn forward. Pawn to perfectly meet pawn. Center fighting against center. It was the oldest, most fundamentally solid answer in the entire history of the game. It took the child exactly 3 seconds to respond. Fast hands, Langford mocked, shaking his head with fake pity. Fast hands usually lose fast games. Move 2. And here came the white queen. Langford immediately grabbed his absolute most powerful piece on the entire board. He swung her wildly out into the open, sliding her aggressively toward the little boy's side of the board. Langford was aiming her directly at the absolute weakest square on the black side. The one tiny fragile square beside the black king that only the king himself defends. It was a dirty, cheap bar fight of a move. It was an incredibly disrespectful 4-move checkmate attempt. A crude trick explicitly designed to instantly destroy panicked beginners and humiliate children. Somebody in the elite crowd who actually understood the game whispered loudly to his date. Oh my God, Edward is going straight for the scholar's mate. He is literally trying to end a little kid in 4 moves. That is brutal. Miles glanced down at the attacking white queen. Then the tiny 6-year-old boy did something incredibly small, but utterly terrifying. He smiled. He did not smile at the arrogant billionaire. He smiled softly down at the wooden board. Exactly the way you smile at a dear old friend who is telling a funny joke you have already heard 100 times before. His tiny hand reached out, and his black knight came out of the back rank. It moved calmly, quietly, like a patient hotel doorman stepping into the street. The knight perfectly defended the immediate threat and developed a powerful piece in the exact same breath. For seconds, standing at the edge of the mahogany table, Grandmaster Walter Hayes suddenly stopped watching the game. He started intently watching the tiny boy. Because Hayes had seen that exact, aggressive queen attack 10,000 times in his long career, but almost never against amateurs. When a powerful queen charges violently at an amateur, the amateur usually panics. They wildly throw pawns in front of her like desperate sandbags, ruining their own position out of pure blinding fear. This 6-year-old boy had not flinched a single millimeter. His knight did not just block the attack. It aggressively claimed the center of the board and quietly asked the charging white queen a terrifying question. And what exactly are you going to do now? Move 3. Langford angrily developed his white bishop, aiming it straight down the long diagonal line at the boy's king like a hidden sniper finally finding an open window. 3 moves, Langford announced loudly to the laughing room. checking his obscenely expensive vintage watch theatrically. 3 moves away from ending this pathetic joke. He looked up at the serving staff. "Anyone want to order the little rat a cab? He and his mother will be leaving my property very soon." Cruel, high-pitched laughter rippled violently through the massive room. In the very back of the crowd, completely hidden by the tuxedos, Denise gripped a heavy wooden door frame with both of her raw hands. Her lips were moving rapidly in desperate, silent prayer. A kind waitress gently touched her shaking shoulder and stayed quietly beside her. Then 6-year-old Miles made his third move, and the glittering ballroom got its absolute first shocking surprise of the night. The tiny boy pushed a single pawn on the far side of the board. It was a quiet, seemingly useless little move that appeared to do absolutely nothing at all. Except for one terrifying detail. It left another one of his black pawns sitting completely alone, totally undefended, directly in the open path of Langford's hungry white queen. It was a free piece of meat, a gift perfectly wrapped and heavily ribboned, handed right to the billionaire. The knowledgeable whisperer in the crowd groaned out loud. "Oh no, the kid just hung a pawn. He blundered terribly. It's over." Edward Langford saw the vulnerable piece too. His vicious, arrogant grin came back incredibly wide and starvingly hungry. "Do you see that, everyone?" Langford yelled, spreading his arms. "This is exactly what happens when you let uneducated trash sit at tables where they do not belong." His manicured hand floated hungrily over his white queen. "I almost feel bad taking his money." But Walter Hayes's eyes suddenly narrowed to dangerous tiny slits. A sharp flicker of pure shock crossed the Grandmaster's face, completely gone in half a second. Hayes had seen the undefended pawn too. But unlike every single other arrogant billionaire in that ballroom, Hayes had also seen exactly what was silently waiting in the dark right behind it. Under the heavy mahogany table, Miles's tiny thumb brushed the completely worn wooden crown of his grandfather's piece one more time. The deadly trap that his grandfather had patiently taught him on a freezing rainy Saturday in the slums. The incredibly cruel trap designed specifically for arrogant bullies who chase lunch money. It was now completely open for business. All it desperately needed now was a greedy, arrogant man's hand to touch a queen. Langford proudly picked her up. "Move 4. The white queen viciously took the bait. Edward Langford aggressively snatched the completely undefended black pawn from the board. He held the tiny wooden piece up high between his perfectly manicured thumb and forefinger, showing it off to the glittering crowd exactly like a bloody trophy pulled from a slaughtered animal. He turned his hand slowly, making absolutely sure that every single recording smartphone in the entire ballroom caught a perfect high-definition angle of his total dominance. "One down," Langford announced with a sickening, victorious chuckle. "The rest of them are coming very, very soon." Light, incredibly polite applause fluttered through the massive room. Someone in the back, holding a crystal glass of $1,000 champagne, actually whistled in approval. What the arrogant billionaire absolutely did not notice, and what almost nobody in that entire uneducated crowd noticed, was exactly where his incredibly expensive white queen was now standing. She was sitting deep, deep inside enemy territory. She was completely isolated, entirely alone, and dangerously far away from her own defending army. She was utterly surrounded by hostile black squares that belonged entirely to a silent 6-year-old child. Let me tell you a secret about chess traps. It is the exact same secret that Pops used to explain at the freezing concrete tables in the slums. You do not ever catch a starving, rabid wolf by aggressively chasing it through the dark woods. If you chase it, the wolf will simply run away. No, you catch a rabid wolf by making it incredibly, desperately hungry. You patiently leave pieces of raw meat on the cold ground, one tiny piece at a time. You drop each piece of meat a little bit deeper into a narrow, dark canyon. The arrogant wolf eats the first piece, then the second. The wolf thinks it is winning. The wolf believes with absolute certainty that it is the smartest, most powerful animal in the entire valley. Right up until the exact terrifying moment it finally turns around to go home, and suddenly realizes how far into the dark it has blindly walked. And then it finally sees the walls closing in. Miles answered move 4 without a single fraction of a second of hesitation. His tiny, fragile hand reached out again. His second black knight stepped smoothly out from the back rank, just as quiet and deadly as the first one. It aimed its carved wooden head, though absolutely nobody in the entire room but Grandmaster Hayes could clearly see it yet, at a highly specific empty square exactly 3 moves into the future. Inside the 6-year-old boy's tiny head, his grandfather's raspy, warm voice kept perfect time like a ticking metronome. Develop your pieces with a deadly threat, little man. Make every single soldier earn his square. Let the big, arrogant man eat his fill. Move 5. Langford, feeling obscenely generous and completely, historically invincible, greedily grabbed a second black pawn. This specific pawn was sitting right in front of the little boy's queenside. Violently taking it pulled the white queen even further away from her own white king. She was acting exactly like an arrogant, foolish general wandering far away from his own protected army, just to blindly loot an abandoned farmhouse. The wealthy crowd absolutely loved it. They practically swooned. 2 pieces up, the terrifying billionaire was clearly winning the slaughter. Crystal glasses clinked loudly somewhere in the back of the massive room. Anyone in the world keeping score purely by counting the captured wooden material would confidently say that Edward Langford was light years ahead. But chess is never ever scored by material. It is scored by one single absolute thing. And little Miles's immediate answer to move 5 showed the entire room exactly what that thing was. The boy's dark squared bishop slid smoothly out along the long open diagonal line. It settled firmly onto a dark square where it stared unblinking, like a sniper rifle, straight toward the White King's unprotected front porch. Now take a long hard look at the board and count the black pieces aggressively pointed directly at Langford's home rank. 1 knight, 2 knights, a deadly bishop, and a black queen still sitting perfectly calm in her starting position, looking exactly like a dark, gathering storm that simply hadn't decided exactly when and where to violently land. Langford confidently reached out for his crystal glass of expensive scotch, and suddenly found it completely empty. He impatiently snapped his fingers in the air, signaling a terrified waiter to bring him a refill without even bothering to look up. And the massive room suddenly watched a powerful billionaire wait awkwardly for his own staff for the very first time in recent memory. Move 6. For the absolute first time all night, Edward Langford actually had to stop and think. The arrogant smirk slowly began to freeze on his face. He stared down at the $50,000 board, and somewhere deep, deep behind his cold eyes, an incredibly old survival instinct from his college days suddenly woke up and started screaming in pure panic. His white queen was 2 pawns rich, but she was completely and utterly alone in a sea of black squares. His own white knights were still hopelessly locked inside their starting stables, entirely undeveloped. His white king was standing awkwardly in the absolute center of the board, completely exposed, like a man standing in a freezing blizzard with his winter coat unbuttoned, and the tiny 6-year-old boy's pieces. When exactly had they all gotten out of the back rank? They were perfectly arranged in a complex, terrifying pattern that Langford almost vaguely recognized. It looked like something from an ancient, dusty Russian chess book he had quickly skimmed over 30 long years ago. Something with a massive, deadly warning label permanently attached to it. The glittering ballroom slowly began to notice the suffocating, heavy silence. 30 agonizing seconds passed. Then a full, excruciating minute. The disgusting smirk on Langford's face stayed aggressively in place, but it had completely stopped reaching his cold, dead eyes. He nervously pulled a pure silk handkerchief from his tailored breast pocket and pressed it quickly once against his sweating hairline. "Taking your sweet time there, Edward?" a wealthy colleague called out from the crowd, trying to sound friendly and supportive. The nervous laugh that followed the joke was significantly thinner and weaker than the confident ones before it. Langford moved his piece at last. He defensively pulled his white queen back exactly 1 square. It was a tiny, pathetic retreat, desperately dressed up to look like a strategic repositioning. It was the absolute first backward step of the entire night. Miles answered the move in exactly 3 seconds. The 6-year-old boy calmly castled his black king into absolute impenetrable safety. His black rook slid over smoothly like a heavy iron bank vault door bolting permanently shut. Everything on the boy's side of the board was perfectly tidy. Everything was flawlessly connected. At the thick velvet rope line of the elite spectators, a terrified portfolio manager leaned nervously toward Grandmaster Hayes and whispered frantically, "Walter, you have to level with me right now. The little kid is just incredibly lucky, right?" Grandmaster Hayes did not take his observing, calm eyes off the glowing wooden board for a single second. "Luck moves incredibly fast and thinks incredibly slow," Hayes whispered back, his voice chillingly cold. "That little boy is doing the exact opposite." Hayes paused, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the terrifying architecture of the black pieces. "I have seen this exact, flawless setup before at international master tournaments in Europe. The patient queen hunt, the quiet, deadly development, the suffocating patience." Hayes slowly turned his head to look directly at the sweating portfolio manager. "He is not defending his pieces, gentlemen. He is hunting." "Hunting?" The manager swallowed hard. "Hunting what?" "The single most expensive, vulnerable piece on the board." Word of that terrifying, whispered exchange between Grandmaster Hayes and the panicked portfolio manager traveled through the suffocating crowd the exact same way a highly contagious, deadly virus spreads. It moved significantly faster than the silver champagne trays. The wealthy elite guests who had been cruelly smirking and laughing just 5 agonizing minutes ago suddenly completely stopped smiling. They started narrating the intense game frantically and quietly into their expensive, glowing smartphones. The arrogant nephew's live stream viewer count did not just slowly climb. It violently and aggressively exploded. It rapidly rolled past 10,000 viewers, then 20,000, then a staggering 40,000 people. In cramped, freezing city apartments, in noisy neighborhood barbershops, and on crowded, dark night buses across the entire country, absolute strangers were suddenly tuning in. They were all watching a tiny 6-year-old child in faded, taped-up sneakers sit perfectly still and stare down an apex predator of Wall Street. Over by the grand, towering doorway of the ballroom, Denise had completely stopped her desperate praying. She let go of the heavy wooden door frame. She was staring intently at her tiny son's face, that incredibly calm, unhurried, ancient little face. And she was suddenly seeing somebody else living vividly inside it. She saw her late father's unshakable, terrifying stillness. She saw her father's cold, calculating eyes staring out from a 6-year-old's body. Her raw, bleach-stained hand rose slowly, shaking violently, to cover her trembling mouth. All these exhausting, degrading years, she thought wildly to herself. All those quiet, mysterious Saturdays when he disappeared. The glowing, faint laptop light leaking silently under his closed bedroom door late into the pitch-black night. She was absolutely not watching a tiny boy in terrible trouble anymore. She was watching her father's ultimate, final lesson being played out loud across a $50,000 mahogany table. Back at the glowing board, Edward Langford roughly rolled his tight, tense shoulders and violently forced the arrogant, sickening grin back onto his heavily sweating face. "Cute," Langford spat, his voice noticeably louder, thinner, and far more desperate than before. "You have memorized a few little parlor tricks from a cheap library book. I will generously give you that. Your kindergarten teacher must be so incredibly proud of you." He leaned heavily over the expensive board, aggressively invading the child's small personal space. He lowered his voice into a dark, threatening, toxic growl so only the terrified guests in the absolute front row could clearly hear him. "Enjoy your 15 seconds of pathetic fame while it lasts, you little rat," Langford hissed like a cornered snake. "Men like me do not ever lose to worthless people like you. The real world simply does not allow it. I own this world." Miles slowly, deliberately looked up from the glowing wooden pieces. For the absolute first time since sitting down in that massive velvet-lined chair, the tiny 6-year-old boy looked the terrifying billionaire directly in his cold, dead eyes. And the child held the billionaire's gaze without blinking a single solitary time. "My grandfather used to say," Miles said, his tiny, crystal-clear voice cutting violently through the heavy, suffocating silence of the massive room like a perfectly sharpened razor blade. "He said that the board does not ask how much money you have in the bank, sir." Miles gave a single, slow, terrifying nod toward the violently complicated position trapped between them. "It is your move." Somewhere in the thick, suffocating crowd of millionaires, an incredibly high-definition phone camera zoomed in perfectly on Edward Langford's sweating face. The short, brutal video clip of what it caught right there, the sudden, undeniable flicker of absolute, paralyzing terror, the heavy, nervous swallowing, the very first terrifying crack in 30 years of unearned toxic certainty, would be violently replayed and overanalyzed 11 million times on the internet before the week was even out. But the specific legendary moment the internet would absolutely never stop screaming about, the exact moment that permanently turned a cruel party trick into a brutal piece of modern history, was still exactly 3 moves away. Move 7. The terrifying move that violently broke the entire room in half. Miles calmly reached out his tiny, fragile hand for his Black Knight. The very first one, the patient doorman that had stepped out on move 2. He lifted the heavy wooden piece and set it down firmly, with a sharp, echoing click, on a square deep inside white territory. He placed it directly where Langford's pawn could easily, violently take it for absolutely free. Then the 6-year-old boy simply folded his tiny hands neatly in his lap and waited in absolute silence. The elite crowd gasped out loud in collective, genuine shock. Even the incredibly wealthy guests who did not understand a single solitary thing about chess understood exactly what a free, completely unprotected piece looked like when they saw one. "He is cracking under the immense pressure," somebody in a $1,000 tuxedo loudly whispered to his diamond-covered wife. The fear finally got to the poor kid's head. Edward Langford laughed out loud. It was a loud, desperate, booming bark of pure, unadulterated relief flooding his sweating face, looking exactly like color aggressively returning to a pale corpse. "First you stupidly give me the free pawns, and now you just hand me this?" Langford gloated, his massive, fragile ego instantly reinflating to its maximum size. "Thank you, boy. It is completely over." Langford aggressively snatched the Black Knight from the board and dropped it loudly beside the table with his other stolen wooden trophies. He looked up from the board, his chest puffed out in arrogant triumph. Langford smirked over at the silver-haired referee standing perfectly still by the table. "Walter, my good friend, Langford sneered loudly for the cameras. "You were just saying something incredibly dramatic about me getting hurt?" Grandmaster Walter Hayes did not smile back. He did not laugh. He did not even blink. Instead, the legendary Grandmaster slowly, deliberately stood up from his relaxed posture. A Grandmaster of his incredibly high legendary caliber absolutely does not ever stand up in the middle of a casual, meaningless party game. The few educated people in the room who truly knew that specific fact went dead quiet first. And that terrifying, heavy silence spread violently outward from them like thick black ice freezing rapidly across a massive winter pond. Hayes stepped closer to the table and studied the board for a long, agonizing moment. Then he spoke loudly, his voice booming with unquestionable, crushing authority, making absolutely sure that every single recording phone caught every syllable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes announced, his voice ringing like a heavy iron bell. "For the absolute official record, that night's sacrifice was not a blunder." The room completely stopped breathing. "It was an invitation," Hayes continued, looking directly at the sweating billionaire. "And what you are all watching right now is a mathematically forced checkmate." Hayes paused, letting the devastating words hang in the freezing air. "Calculated, I strongly suspect, from the little boy's very first move of the game. For 3 full agonizing seconds, absolutely nobody in that glittering massive ballroom dared to take a single breath. Then the entire room violently flipped. It happened the exact same way a massive, panicked crowd always flips. It did not happen gradually. It happened all at once, like a heavy, sinking ship suddenly catching a violent, opposing wind and capsizing. The elite, wealthy guests who had been cruelly laughing at the $20 bill just moments ago violently pressed closer to the mahogany table, shoving each other out of the way, holding their recording phones high in the air. The arrogant nephew's live-stream viewer count spun violently out of control, rocketing past 40,000, then 50,000, then 60,000 viewers in a matter of seconds. Someone in the frantic, scrolling comments section typed out the exact question that would aggressively trend worldwide by morning. "Who the hell is this kid?" The sudden, terrifying shift in the room had a very specific sound to it, too. The cruel, mocking laughter was completely gone, instantly replaced by the low, electric, buzzing hum of 200 incredibly wealthy people aggressively choosing a brand new favorite gladiator. A terrified waiter completely dropped his heavy tray of champagne, not even bothering to clean up the shattered crystal on the floor, just so he could aggressively watch the board. The famous celebrity chef walked slowly out of the kitchen, his white apron still on, staring in absolute disbelief. Even the hired string quartet players physically left their expensive instruments on the floor and pushed their way violently into the massive, suffocating circle. Standing near the towering glass windows was a heavily built man named Charles Whitfield. He was the powerful founder of Whitfield Pension Partners and the absolute largest single investor in Langford Capital. He had $800 million of hardworking teachers and firefighters' retirement money parked directly in Edward Langford's arrogant judgment. But right now, Charles Whitfield was absolutely not watching the glowing wooden board. He was watching Edward Langford's perfectly manicured hands. They had started to shake. They were trembling violently, uncontrollably, knocking loudly against the edge of the heavy mahogany table. And the absolute cruelest part of all was that Edward Langford fully knew it. He could physically feel the entire glittering room rapidly leaving him. The exact same room of spineless elites that had laughed on his strict cue for 20 years was suddenly smelling his blood in the water. And the ancient primal instinct that had built a $4 billion empire screamed at him, telling him exactly what he needed to do to survive. Throw more money at the problem. Crush it with pure, unadulterated capital. $2 million. Langford suddenly barked out, his voice cracking loudly, sounding incredibly desperate and horribly loud. Let's make it actually interesting, boy. $2 million against anything. Are you scared now, you little rat? The sheer naked desperation in his screaming voice embarrassed absolutely everyone in the room. A corrupt senator awkwardly studied his expensive Italian shoes. Two billionaires' wives exchanged a deeply uncomfortable look over their half-empty crystal glasses. 6-year-old Miles did not even bother to look up from the glowing wooden board. "The bet stands exactly as it is, sir," the tiny boy said, his tiny voice entirely empty of emotion. $1 million. A heavy beat of silence passed. "It is still your move." Somewhere behind the thick, suffocating crowd of millionaires, Denise Brooks stood taller and prouder than she had in 6 long, degrading years. And sitting at the heavy mahogany table, Edward Langford looked down in absolute, blinding terror at a chess position that was quietly, inevitably closing around his white king exactly like a spiked iron fist. He was exactly 2 moves away from total irreversible checkmate. And the entire connected world was about to watch him die on the board. 11 excruciating minutes. That is exactly how long the terrifying billionaire stared blindly at the $50,000 board before finally touching a piece on move 8. The massive ballroom waited in deafening silence. 200 elite guests, 60,000 screaming strangers on a live stream, and one incredibly proud mother standing by the kitchen door, all violently watching a man worth $4 billion desperately search for a hidden exit that Grandmaster Walter Hayes had already publicly announced did not exist. Langford tried anyway. With a violently shaking hand, he shoved a white knight back toward his trapped king, moving it like a terrified bodyguard arriving far too late to a blazing fire. He let go of the heavy wooden piece like the wood was physically burning his skin. And now at long last the Black Queen moved. All night long she had waited patiently on her starting square, looking exactly like a dark, gathering storm that simply hadn't decided when to strike. Miles lifted her gently with his tiny, fragile fingers. He did not slam her down. Pops absolutely never allowed angry slamming at the stone tables. The 6-year-old boy swept his queen across the entire length of the board in one long, devastating, beautiful diagonal line. She drove straight into the absolute heart of White's collapsing territory. She settled onto her final square with a soft, final click of wood on wood that every single person in the room heard clearly, because absolutely no one was making any other sound at all. "Check," Miles said quietly. Look incredibly closely at the White King now. He was violently pinned back into the darkest corner of his own golden kingdom. His precious escape squares were completely occupied, not by the boys attacking enemy pieces, but by his very own expensive army. His heavy rook stood uselessly in one corner like an incredibly heavy piece of furniture that he could not move. His own pawns, which he had foolishly never advanced, walled him in completely from the front like a locked iron gate. The white knight that had just arrived completely blocked the very last escape door. Every single expensive guard that Edward Langford owned, every single piece of power he thought protected him, had violently become the unyielding brick walls of his own tiny, claustrophobic prison. His massive wealth had trapped him. There was exactly one single legal move left on the entire board. Langford made it. He slid his White King deep into the final empty corner square. He moved exactly the way a terrified, broken man slowly backs into the very last corner of a burning, collapsing room with absolutely nowhere left to run. His hand was trembling so violently that the incredibly heavy, expensive wooden piece rocked back and forth unsteadily when he finally set it down. Move 9. The massive, glittering ballroom physically seemed to lean in, holding its collective breath. The blinding chandelier light caught the sharp edge of the $50,000 board. Somewhere deep in the suffocating silence, you could actually hear ice slowly melting in abandoned crystal glasses. You could hear the faint electronic hum of dozens of phone cameras zooming all the way in on the sweating billionaire. And you could hear the short, incredibly shallow, panicked breathing of a broken man who had just bet $1 million and his entire life's reputation on his own absolute superiority. Miles took 1 second, maybe 2. Then, his remaining black knight slowly rose from the board. It gracefully hopped over the thick fence of pawns, moving exactly like the deadly eel that thinks exactly like a sniper's knife. And the wooden piece landed softly, firmly, on the one single square from which absolutely no answer has ever existed in the entire bloody history of the game. "Checkmate," Miles said. He did not scream it loudly. He was not boastful or triumphant. He said it exactly the way his grandfather used to say it at the freezing concrete tables in the slums. He said it softly, calmly, almost kindly, the exact same way you gently tell a foolish man terrible news that he absolutely should have seen coming from miles away. 9 moves. It was the legendary smothered mate. It is the absolute oldest, most agonizingly humiliating death in the entire game of chess. An arrogant king buried alive, completely crushed to death by the sheer weight of his very own army. Grandmaster Hayes would excitedly explain the complex brilliance of it to stunned news reporters later that week, breaking it down step by agonizing step. The hung pawns that brilliantly pulled the white queen completely out of position. The shocking knight sacrifice that forcefully kicked open the front door. The incredibly quiet developing moves that perfectly aimed every single black piece at one specific deadly square. 9 moves planned flawlessly like 9 perfect sentences of a single devastating death warrant. Then the tiny 6-year-old boy reached deep into his faded, taped-up pocket. He slowly brought out the small, incredibly old wooden king. The one with the tiny crown worn completely smooth by 40 years of an exhausted old man's heavy thumb, and 3 years of a tiny boy's desperate grip. Miles reached across the $50,000 mahogany board and stood his grandfather's cheap wooden piece gently beside it, directly facing the fallen billionaire. "This is for the man who patiently taught me," the 6-year-old boy said, his clear voice ringing through the absolute silence. He played chess at freezing concrete tables in a dirty public park for his entire life, for $5 a game. Miles looked directly into Edward Langford's terrified, shattered eyes. He was infinitely better and infinitely smarter than every single wealthy person in this entire room. And nobody ever even knew his name. For 3 agonizing, breathless seconds, absolute, suffocating silence reigned over the massive, glittering ballroom. 200 of the wealthiest people on the entire planet stood completely frozen, staring in sheer, unadulterated shock at the $50,000 board, and the tiny 6-year-old child sitting quietly behind it. Then a single pair of hands slowly began to applaud. The clapping was slow, deliberate, and incredibly loud, ringing off the imported marble walls like consecutive gunshots. It was Grandmaster Walter Hayes. He was not just clapping politely. He was applauding with deep, profound, genuine reverence for a brilliant mind. A mere heartbeat later, the massive, invisible dam holding the room back completely shattered, and the ballroom violently erupted. It was utter absolute chaos. Waiters in crisp white uniforms, corrupt senators, diamond-drenched billionaires' wives, and rival hedge fund managers all started shouting and clapping simultaneously. On the arrogant nephew's glowing smartphone, the live stream viewer count completely broke the server's algorithm. It rocketed past 80,000, then 90,000, hitting over 100,000 absolute strangers simultaneously flooding the frantic chat box with one single repeated word: typed over and over again in rapid succession. King, king, king. Through the blinding, chaotic sea of expensive tuxedos and designer dresses, Denise Brooks began to walk. She crossed the incredibly expensive, polished floor that she had scrubbed on her raw, bleeding hands and knees for 6 agonizing years. And for the absolute first time in her entire life, the terrifying wealthy elites physically moved out of her way. They parted for the exhausted housekeeper like the Red Sea, completely lowering their expensive phone cameras as she walked past them. She did not look at a single one of them. She walked straight up to the heavy mahogany table, dropped to her tired knees, took her tiny 6-year-old son's face in both of her trembling hands, and pressed her forehead tightly against his. She wept not out of fear, but out of a sudden, overwhelming, explosive pride that no amount of billionaire money could ever possibly buy. And Edward Langford sat exactly where he was, completely trapped in the massive, suffocating eye of all that deafening applause. He was staring blankly down at his prized $50,000 board, at a white king pathetically smothered to death by its very own expensive soldiers, on a wooden battlefield where, for the absolute first time in his entirely privileged life, his massive wealth had counted for absolutely nothing at all. The deafening applause was still rolling heavily through the ballroom when Edward Langford finally, desperately found his voice. All right, enough of this," Langford yelled, his voice cracking violently with pure panic. He stood up abruptly, his velvet chair screeching harshly against the marble floor. He frantically straightened his custom-tailored jacket and reached desperately for his old, arrogant grin the exact same way a terrified, drowning man pats his empty pockets looking for a lost life vest. "The fun is over, everyone," Langford boomed, forcing a loud, entirely fake laugh. "Hell of a cute little party trick. The kid has obviously been heavily coached by someone, but I have to admit it was very, very cute." The massive room slowly stopped clapping. The 200 elite guests stared at him with cold, entirely unreadable predatory eyes. "The bet." Langford waved his perfectly manicured hand dismissively, his sweating face twitching uncontrollably. "Come on, everyone, let's be serious adults here. Nobody actually hands a certified check for $1 million to a 6-year-old child over a silly little board game." He forced another sickening chuckle that echoed horribly in the suddenly quiet room. "It was a joke. I was just spicing up the evening. Everybody here knew it was just a joke to entertain my guests." Absolutely nobody in the glittering ballroom laughed. Not a single solitary soul. That is the incredibly dangerous thing about rooms filled entirely with apex predators and corporate sharks. They can instantly smell a bleeding wound, and they can smell pathetic, desperate weakness from a mile away, because most of them got disgustingly rich by happily feeding on it. Walter Hayes spoke first, his tone as dry and merciless as a high court judge reading a final devastating death warrant. "You stated the terms of the wager yourself, Edward," Hayes said, his voice easily carrying across the massive room. "You stated them incredibly clearly for the entire room to hear, specifically at my formal request." Hayes took a slow, deliberate step toward the sweating billionaire. $1 million. Formally witnessed by 200 of your closest colleagues, and physically recorded, as I currently understand it, on several dozen high-definition smartphones. Hayes turned his calm eyes toward the arrogant nephew holding the glowing screen, including a live stream. "How many innocent people are watching that broadcast right now, young man?" The terrified nephew swallowed hard, his voice shaking. 112,000, sir." That massive, staggering number landed directly on Edward Langford's shoulders like a collapsing concrete roof beam. Hayes calmly folded his hands in front of him. "So," the Grandmaster said coldly, "you have exactly 2 choices right now. You can instantly honor the bet. Or 112,000 people can watch a $4 billion fund manager explicitly prove that his official word and his professional honor mean absolutely nothing the exact moment it actually costs him his own money. Hayes tilted his head slightly. In your specific line of business, Edward, which of those two options is ultimately more expensive? But before the hyperventilating billionaire could even stammer out a pathetic response, Charles Whitfield stepped heavily out of the thick crowd. The massive, intimidating founder of Whitfield Pension Partners walked slowly toward the table, and the entire room immediately rearranged its gravity around his immense weight. $800 million, Edward, Whitfield said quietly. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a terrifying, crushing weight that instantly froze Langford's blood. That is exactly what my hard-working middle-class pensioners currently have riding on your professional judgment, Whitfield continued, staring at Langford with absolute, unadulterated disgust. Tonight, I got to watch your judgment completely up close. Whitfield pointed a thick, accusing finger directly at Langford's chest. You aggressively picked a public fight with a 6-year-old child just to make your fragile ego feel incredibly tall. You completely missed a glaring elementary chess trap that a grandmaster says was 9 moves deep. And your absolute first cowardly instinct, in front of every single one of your investors, was to publicly welch on your own bet. Whitfield slowly and deliberately buttoned his expensive coat. My legal office will be calling yours first thing on Monday morning to pull our entire fund. We are completely done here. The last remaining drops of color violently drained from Edward Langford's sweating face in real time, broadcast perfectly on 112,000 glowing screens worldwide. Langford violently grabbed for the absolute only pathetic rope he knew how to use. Walter. Charles. Please, gentlemen, be reasonable. Langford begged, his voice rising to a shrill, humiliating whine. We can easily handle this privately. My attorneys can draft something up right now. A nice college scholarship for the little rat. Maybe a generous charitable gesture. The specific word you are looking for, Edward, Hayes interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, is payment. Then Denise Brooks slowly stood up from the floor. She did something she had absolutely never, ever done in 6 agonizing, soul-crushing years of silent service in that horrific mansion. She stepped forcefully forward and spoke directly to her billionaire employer without being spoken to first. Mr. Langford, Denise said. Her voice did not shake a single solitary millimeter. It was forged from pure, unbreakable iron. For 6 grueling years I silently cleaned this massive house. You aggressively billed my miserable paycheck for a cheap wine glass that your own drunken guest broke. You called me the help for so incredibly long. I honestly wonder if you ever even bothered to learn my actual name. She stepped closer to the sweating, ruined billionaire, holding her 6-year-old son's tiny hand tightly in hers. My name is Denise. Denise Brooks. And this incredibly brilliant young man standing here is Miles Theodore Brooks. Denise looked the billionaire dead in his terrified, shrinking eyes. We were absolutely never beneath you, sir. You simply needed us to be. Somewhere in the massive, shocked crowd, someone actually began to clap again, trying to desperately break the suffocating tension. But Grandmaster Walter Hayes immediately raised a firm, commanding hand to stop it. Not yet, Hayes said quietly. The entire room instantly understood. The tiny 6-year-old boy was not finished yet. Miles slowly rose from his heavy velvet chair. He walked quietly around the massive mahogany table, his taped-up sneakers making absolutely no sound on the imported Italian marble. He walked directly over to where the crumpled $20 bill still lay completely untouched on the cold floor. It had been lying right there for the entire duration of the game, and absolutely nobody in the room had dared to touch it. Miles bent down and picked it up with his tiny, fragile fingers. He carefully smoothed out the deep wrinkles in the green paper, pressing it perfectly flat. Then, he walked back to the $50,000 board and set the dirty $20 bill gently down right beside the completely smothered, defeated White King. "Keep it, sir," the 6-year-old boy said, his voice echoing with ancient, terrifying finality. "You are going to need it a lot more than I will." He wasn't smiling when he said it. He wasn't angry either. He sounded exactly like the wooden board itself. Patient, level, and absolutely final. The high-definition video clip of that specific devastating moment, the dirty $20 bill, the smothered White King, the tiny boy's steady, unbreakable voice, would officially become the single most replayed 8 seconds on the entire internet that year. And Edward Langford just stood there in the exact center of his own massive ballroom, directly under his own blinding chandelier, entirely surrounded by 200 elite guests who violently refused to even meet his eyes. He was a man suddenly, completely, and utterly alone in the massive fortress that just 20 short minutes earlier had belonged to him in every single way that mattered. That night, the wealthy guests filed out of the mansion incredibly early in absolute, dead silence. The usually chaotic valet line was completely quiet, and on 112,000 glowing screens, then 500,000, then a staggering 2 million, the live stream recording kept violently spreading. It carried the legendary name of Miles Brooks all the way up to the stars, and it dragged the terrifying name of Edward Langford all the way down into the darkest mud. By sunrise the next morning, the video had 10 million views. By Sunday night, 25 million. The ruthless internet, which rapidly names absolutely everything, named Edward Langford within a matter of hours the 9-move billionaire. The humiliating nickname aggressively followed him everywhere. It followed him onto national cable news broadcasts, into the private encrypted group chats of his very own employees, and directly onto the screaming floor of the New York Stock Exchange. A massive financial news network literally played the brutal checkmate video clip on a continuous loop, right next to a rapidly crashing graph of his hedge fund's daily returns. The news anchor did not even have to say a single word. He just raised a mocking eyebrow at the camera, and millions of viewers understood the joke perfectly. The Monday morning immediately following the disastrous party, Whitfield Pension Partners officially filed an aggressive notice of full, immediate redemption. $800 million completely gone. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 more massive institutional investors violently followed suit. Because in Edward Langford's elite, high-stakes business, professional judgment is the absolute only product you have to sell. And the entire connected world had just watched his arrogant judgment violently lose to a 6-year-old child in exactly 9 moves, and then pathetically attempt to skip the bill. The $1 million bet itself never even reached a public courtroom. It absolutely didn't need to. Langford's own terrified attorneys laid out the brutal, undeniable situation for him behind closed doors. A clearly stated, legally binding wager. 200 wealthy witnesses. Dozens of high-definition video recordings. A legendary grandmaster who had formally called for the terms on camera. Fighting the bet in court would mean months of devastating, humiliating global headlines. Paying it immediately would mean only one. He paid. The certified stamped check arrived at a tiny freezing apartment in the poorest district of the city on a quiet Tuesday morning. It was the exact same day of the week that Pops had died. Denise Brooks held the incredibly heavy piece of paper in both of her raw, cracked hands for a very, very long time. Then she sat down at her cheap, wobbly kitchen table, looked up at the ceiling, and finally cried the way you violently cry when an agonizing war is finally permanently over. She never, ever cleaned another rich person's house again. As for Langford Capital, the massive firm did not even survive the calendar year. The massive investor redemptions quickly became a terrifying bank run. The run violently became a desperate fire sale. And by the very next spring, the terrifying hedge fund that had once managed $4 billion was being slowly, ruthlessly wound down by corporate lawyers who billed by the expensive hour, and who absolutely never laughed at Langford's jokes. Langford barely managed to keep the empty mansion. He was forced to sell the Renaissance paintings. He sold the vintage cars. And the massive $50,000 chessboard went to a public auction, where a completely anonymous online bidder bought it for exactly half its original value. The anonymous bidder immediately donated it, with what can only be described as a brutal, cutting sense of humor, to an underfunded public elementary school chess club in the slums. Nobody ever officially proved exactly who the wealthy anonymous bidder was. But Grandmaster Walter Hayes always smiled a very particular, knowing smile whenever desperate reporters asked him about it. Most of the $1 million went directly into building something powerful called the Mason Foundation, named to honor a humble hotel doorman the elite chess world never bothered to know. The foundation fully pays for heavy wooden boards, professional coaches, and expensive tournament entry fees for brilliant kids trapped in working-class neighborhoods. Denise runs the massive operation herself. It turns out that 6 grueling years of meticulously managing a billionaire's chaotic household will flawlessly teach you logistics. And a lifetime of being aggressively underestimated will teach you exactly which quiet, invisible kids to fiercely look out for. Her very last, official act as a terrified housekeeper had been incredibly short. She rode the freezing 5:40 a.m. train one final glorious morning. She confidently set her heavy ring of brass keys on Langford's polished marble counter, and she left a single, handwritten note directly beside them. It simply read, "We quit being the help." As for the terribly worn wooden king with the smooth, faded crown, it absolutely does not sit in a locked glass trophy case. It rides safely in a 6-year-old boy's taped-up pocket to every single tournament, to every freezing park, and to every single Saturday match, because some inheritances are simply worth infinitely more than $1 million. Now let me completely break the fourth wall and ask you a very real, incredibly uncomfortable question. If you were standing in that glittering, expensive ballroom that night holding a crystal glass of champagne, what would you have actually done? When that billionaire violently threw a dirty $20 bill at the feet of a freezing 6-year-old child, would you have laughed along with the rest of the cowardly sheep just to protect your own wealthy, comfortable status? Or would you have risked your entire career, your money, and your reputation to step out of the crowd and stand in front of that defenseless boy? Be brutally honest with yourself. Drop your answer in the comments below right now. Defend justice, or admit the terrifying cowardice of our society. If this story moved you, share it, hit subscribe, and never let them tell you your move doesn't matter.